Misprinted, Bright Disease by S. Anon. Read by Christopher Hine. It always seemed to be raining in New York these days. Every other night this week, the pitter-patter of rain had drummed against my ears as I walked these streets. It seemed as though the whole world should have been flooded by now, but things kept right on turning as they usually did. I walked past the doorman, a tall, unremarkable fellow who nodded to me. He had a mole on his nose. It didn't make him homely, but it was noticeable. I nodded back and kept walking out onto the busy streets. I didn't have an umbrella, but I didn't mind getting wet. I could hear the sound oozing out of jazz clubs along the sidewalks as I made my way through the cloud-darkened streets. The sun sank low into the sky, a sign for all the crooners and crooks in the city to wake up. They all rose to ply their trade at the end of a horn or the end of a gun. The clouds blanketed the sky, blocked what little sun there was. It looked like midnight, though it wasn't much past 7. The city seemed unperturbed by the clinging wetness that pressed around it. The city never slept. The city never stopped. The city always moved. That was New York, city like no other. As I walked, my coat fluttered around me. I held my arms close to my sides. In the crook of my left, hidden safely away, was an envelope. Inside? The thing I needed to bust this case wide open. There'd been a murder. A man had gone missing a few weeks ago, only to turn up a little while later in a darkened newsroom with the word "liar" pressed into his head like a brand. Letters from a printing press sat next to his body, still red-hot when the police had found them. They'd removed the body from the building and asked the usual questions. After that, the NYPD had been oddly quiet about how the search for the killer was going. Everyone knew what that meant. Money was involved. Big money. Enough to pay a few flatfoots to look the other way. They'd gotten far too good at that lately for my tastes. His wife had come to me a week ago asking for help. He'd been a reporter, deep into some story he'd refused to tell her about. The night before he'd turned up dead, he'd been frantic, gibbering about conspiracies and secret plans. He'd rabbited when she tried to calm him down. That was the last time anyone saw the poor man alive. I'd taken her money, and after a little digging I'd found a lead. In the basement of a library, long closed, I'd found the photos I now protected against the rain. I just needed confirmation. I needed a man to point the finger. Then I could bring the hammer down on the person who'd done this, big money or not. In a flash of lightning I could see the silhouette of the Empire State Building project. Already it had started to stretch above the smaller buildings that crowded around it, like a flower sprouting from the grass. I thought I could see the slight shapes of the workmen still going at it, even now. I hoped I imagined that part. Anyone with sense knew they weren't supposed to be working in conditions like this. It was almost certainly illegal, but how little that mattered after a little green changed hands was something I knew all too well. I adjusted my glasses, turning the collar of my coat up against the wind and the rain. My footsteps were hardly more than a footnote among the quick two-step of New York's millions of dancing feet. In the neon light of the signs, I saw people of all shapes and sizes around me. They were walking, moving, living their lives as they always did. Some of these folks were totally unaware of the dealings around them, and others were stuck so deep in it you couldn't see their ears. Cars honked and moved far too slowly beside me as I walked. It was a trickle of noisy molasses down the warm road compared to the pace of the people around me, pushing forwards. I didn't care about any of them tonight. I only had one person in mind. I kept walking until the blaring noises of the city quieted to a dull roar. When people think of New York, they think of all of it as just one giant, noisy epicenter of people. The heart of it is like that, just like the heart of any city, but New York also had its secret places. It had its nooks and crannies like an old house. These were the kinds of places where the roaches scuttled, where things got lost and dark things dripped and droned under stoves and inside cupboards. The smell of the Hudson hit my nose. It wasn't a horrible smell, once you got used to it, but it was far from being outright pleasant. My red hair was plastered to the side of my head from the rain. The long trench coat I wore clung heavily to me as I made my way towards the remains of a warehouse. I spend a lot of my time around places like this. It's par for the course, really, in my line of work. The private detective business wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I stepped out of the rain and under the shelter of the warehouse. There were holes in the roof. Rain collected in puddles along the concrete floor. The metal walls of this place rumbled, the dripping magnified 1,000 times in a steady drumming beat. The harbours were a noisy place, an echoey place. They were the kind of place where you might not have heard what you thought you'd heard, the perfect place to be up to no good. My source surely was, but I wasn't here to catch him tonight. He was a crook, but he was a crook with standards. He might take a little old lady's coin purse or steal candy from a particularly inattentive baby, but murder was above his pay grade by leaps and bounds, unless his life was personally at stake. He might have been built more like a string bean than a beefcake, but no one looks twice at a string bean. That's what made him dangerous. His name was Henry Allen, but everyone just called him Funny. Maybe it was because his initials spelt out Ha, or maybe he was a real wit around the criminal underworld. I didn't know, and I didn't particularly care. All I wanted was the information I needed. As I got about halfway into the place, I noticed him leaning against the side of a defunct shipping crate. This place was full of them, lining the walls on either side. A single large floodlight illuminated him and most of the space around him. He was smoking a cigarette. I grimaced. I'd always hated those damn things. Mellow Low, the local tobacco peddlers, swore up and down that it was a perfectly healthy pastime. But I don't know. Something about sucking tar into your lungs just doesn't strike me as the key to longevity. Those things will kill you, you know. He looked up the way a thief always looks up. It's a quick jerk of the head and you can see their hearts speed up and their muscles tense. In a moment those eyes assessed 6 major things. The first 2 were if you're a cop or a John. Then, if they should stay or run. And the final 2 decisions that clicked in his eyes was if I was worth robbing or best left alone. He recognised me, and I saw him internally select 1, 1, and 2. Good choices. You shouldn't sneak up on people, Cats. Quickest way to get a few new holes. I shrugged. Force of habit. Have to live up to my namesake. I looked him over. Funny was, for lack of a better term, a funny-looking guy. He had a perpetually shocked expression, eyes just a bit too wide and perhaps a touch too big. He was pale, not much sun to be had in the bowels of New York. Hell, if I had to bet, he'd probably never held a job in his life that didn't take place in the shadows. He wore a once-upon-a-time white button-up shirt with brown slacks. A bowler hat sat perched precariously atop what could only be described as an explosion of black hair that curled off in every direction, in no particular direction, all at the same time. Well, keep that up, and we'll see if you've got 9 lives like your namesake too, he blustered. Now what did you want me here for? I reached into my coat to grab the envelope. My hand brushed against the cold steel of the pistol I'd stored in the same pocket. Generally, it wasn't polite to bring weapons to this kind of meeting. But there was polite, and then there was smart. If I ever had to pick between the 2, the choice was obvious. I passed him the envelope, taking careful measures not to show I was armed. The best weapon is the one your enemy doesn't know you have. I found these in the basement of the old library. If I'm not mistaken, that one on the top shows one Herbert Marlov at the ribbon-cutting of the Daily Horn. His fidgety eyes roamed over the black-and-white photo of all the old bigwigs crowded around the new office. In the middle, my dev reporter held the first edition of the news, smiling like he had not a single trouble in the world. To his left, the editor-in-chief, Boris Boslin, a large, hard man who looked more limestone than human. To his right was the man I was interested in, Herbert Marlov, the biggest man in news, both figuratively and literally. He looked like he could serve to lose a couple pounds. A couple hundred. His bald head shined against the camera flash as his smile oozed over his face like an oil spill. On his lapel sat an obscenely fancy-looking H, embroidered onto a suit that could pay the wages of half the city. At his back, a woman with raven hair and elbow-length gloves, her face turned away from the camera. Funny's eyes widened. "I don't know nothing about no Herbert Marlowe." I cocked a brow. "Oh, really?" Because I know that every other version of that photo, in every other paper in New York, doesn't have his ugly mug in it. He's nowhere on the roster of backers for the paper, not so much as a penny's donation on any record anywhere. Yet there he is, smiling at the opening of one of the papers that's not afraid to print the truth, and I know that that woman behind him is Cassandra Carlyle. I shot him a hard glare. Someone's got a thing for theatrics, Funny. You remember last year? The author with the golden quill in his eye. This seems pretty damn similar. Those frog-like eyes turned wary. "And just what are you insinuating, Cats?" I took a step forward. "I'm insinuating that we both know Miss Carlyle doesn't get out of bed unless it's to get elbow-deep into some trouble. I'm insinuating that the Daily Horn regularly called out the police corruption that runs rampant in the streets, that they weren't afraid to be the mouse taking on the lions in this city. I'm insinuating that they were slated to publish an article on the true nature of Marlowe's media empire. The backroom deals." I took a step. Another step towards the little rat. The scandal swept under the rug. A final step put me right up in his pock-marked face. The disappearance of anyone not willing to grab a broom. Funny looked like he wanted to crawl out of his skin. And what makes you think I know anything about any of that?" I felt his hand shift. I reached out and caught it. Funny cried out in pain as I squeezed along the joints and something clattered to the floor. "Because you wouldn't be reaching for that gun if you didn't." I squeezed harder. I could feel the bones in his fingers grinding against one another. "You shouldn't have let me get this close, Funny. Guns are fine at long range, but it's pretty hard to shoot a man an inch away without him noticing." He stiffened as he felt my own gun dig into the side of his gut. "Unless you get the drop on him." "Well, wait," he yelled. "I didn't mean anything by it. You know how these men are. If I squeal, I won't make the day." I pressed the gun deeper into his belly. "If you don't, you won't meet the hour." He made a strangled, terrified noise, and opened his mouth to spill the beans. Before he could tell me what I wanted to know, a huge boom resonated from outside the warehouse. Something slammed into the earth, shaking the ground beneath our feet. Funny gave a snivelling cry of surprise as I managed to keep us both upright. We rubbernecked to look through the large truck entrance at the side of the warehouse, where a plume of smoke curled up from behind an old 18-wheeler. An angry, burning red light seeked out from underneath the cabin. The sound of a heavy, limping pair of footsteps came out from behind the truck. Crap. That's when the astronaut walked in. He wasn't your traditional astronaut, with the dome head and the bulky white suit. He was sleek, his suit done up in black with occasional blinking lights along his arms and legs. He was big, huge almost, easily 6 feet tall and pretty damn wide in the shoulders too. The thing that encompassed his head wasn't globe-shaped. It was more oblong, blacked out, like Mr. Freeze going through a goth phase. You're probably wondering at this point how I know about any of that. Particularly because America won't perfect space travel for another 40-some-odd years, and Batman won't throw his first batarang at an ice-themed villain for another 30. The thing about that, listener, and I am aware of you, is that I'm not your average detective. It's complicated. The astronaut took another lumbering step forwards, and I noticed that his shoes were still red-hot from however he managed to get here. They burned holes into the concrete floor. The moisture on the ground sizzled and spat under his tread as he took another step towards us. "What the hell is that?" Oh, right. I still had a gun pointed into Funny's gooey bits. Damn it, this was going to be hard to explain. Ah, well, I'd worry about that later. For now, the main article of concern was how this wayward spaceman had found his way into my neck of the woods. I wondered if he could see that I was armed. The gun was pressed pretty close between us, so it might have just looked like we were spooning or something. The spaceman's breathing was loud and ragged. It echoed oddly against the steel walls of the warehouse. With the blacked-out dome around his head, I couldn't quite see where he was looking. He seemed disoriented. which was admittedly, as an astronaut in the 20s, kind of par for the course. I noticed something dripping from his side, a slow, steady trickle of red that mixed with the steaming rain around his feet. Blood. That is something we probably don't want to mess with, I finally answered Funny's question. The black helmet turned squarely towards us, and I saw a thickly gloved hand reach for something at his waist. But I think it wants to mess with us, so how about this? I propose a momentary truce. You don't try to kill me, I don't try to kill you, and we run very, very fast to the nearest bit of cover. Deal? That hand drew something long, bulbous and gun-shaped from his belt. There was a faint green glow around the edges, and the moisture in the air seemed to boil around it, sending steam billowing in a foggy trail as it moved. Funny's eyes widened. Deal! 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 I don't think I could have kept holding him if I wanted to at that point. I let him go, and we both sprinted across the floor, our shoes splashing into the various puddles on the ground. Funny might have looked scrawny, but he could run when the time called for it. The spaceman chose that moment to fire. I hazarded a glance over my shoulder as the sound of electricity hit the air. The smell of ozone flooded the warehouse as a ball of light right around the size of my fist went flying, hissing like a cat in a bath towards Funny's back. Move! I turned left as Funny went right. The thing missed him by a few inches, but he cried out regardless. I was a few feet from the blast and I could still feel the heat coming off of it. The side of Funny's shirt turned brown and singed. He fell over in shock. The rat hit the concrete wrong, crushing his fingers against his body as he hit the concrete with a hiss of pain. The strange projectile hit the steel wall of the warehouse with a sound like a fence pole scraping over a sidewalk. The wall didn't stop it. It kept burning right on through, slowed for a moment like a welder's torch cutting through sheet metal. The wall around it turned bright orange before it broke through, shooting out into the wet night going fast as ever, like the laws of physics didn't apply. Well, that wasn't good. The spaceman took aim at Funny again. He lay there clutching his fingers. I could see from here that one of the bones in his index wasn't right. Getting back up one-handed before he met the same fate as the wall would have been near impossible. My pistol was still in my right hand. It probably wasn't a smart thing to do, but I wasn't about to let some Star Wars wannabe go killing people on my turf. I spun on my heel, backpedaling. I didn't care much about aim. I only wanted distraction. I swung my arm up in the spaceman's general direction and fired twice. The first bullet went wide and missed by a mile, but on the second shot my aim was better. I watched with no small amount of horror as the bullet just bounced off something I couldn't see about 2 feet from his chest. He didn't even flinch. Still, the sound of a gun going off in the middle of a mostly empty, very echoey space is enough to get anyone's attention. He turned from Funny to me, and his strange gun turned with him. The smell of ozone washed over me and he pulled the trigger. I turned away, stumbling for a moment and catching myself on a free hand. I couldn't afford to fall like Funny right now. I very much doubted he'd return the favour of playing rodeo clown, particularly when the bull in question was armed with a ray gun. I ducked to the right, steering myself backwards in a curve to reach Funny, who was still struggling with the pain of his broken finger. The shot missed, but not by much. I felt the intense heat as that ball of plasma soared by 2 feet from me. It singed my hair and gave the skin on the back of my neck the equivalent of a mean sunburn. I ignored the pain and reached Funny in a few quick steps. Without stopping, I grabbed the back of his shirt and more or less hauled him up after me, offering quick internal thanks that I hadn't called upon a much heavier snitch. He stumbled to his feet. The criminal underworld teaches you to recover fast, and once he managed to get his balance, he was running like a track star. We both sprinted across the warehouse floor, the stacks of shipping crates growing less roomy on either side of us. It was a straight shot to the door, but I got the feeling both of us knew that running that distance straight with a gunman at our tails was a death sentence. I turned and ducked behind a row of particularly sturdy-looking crates with Funny at my back. He pretty much rolled to a stop, gasping for breath, the occasional cough breaking up his panicked gibbering. That, kids, is why you don't smoke. While I wait to see if we're going to die or not, I might as well explain a few things to you. You're most likely very confused about what's going on right now. That's a given. Most people would be. To start, my name is Catsgrove Combs. Most people call me Cats for short. I'm a private detective in 1921, and I am perfectly aware that I am a fictional character. Nothing more than a collection of words drifting past your ears and into your brain to form images. Now, with that out of the way, let me say that even though that it is all true, I still very much don't want to die right now. And yes, I can die. Sort of. Look, like I said, it's complicated. But even ideas have a sense of self-preservation. You see, there's a thing about books. Books are, at their very cores, just ideas. Ideas given life and form on the printed page. Ideas are powerful things. They can shape countries or tear them down, improve life or take it away. You probably know this to be true. Ideas are the basis of everything. There is perhaps nothing more potent in this world than a good idea. A good idea can grow legs and run off on its own, far beyond what its creator intended. That's me, basically. Me and a lot of others throughout the realms of these dusty pages. Don't get me wrong, not all characters in every book you've ever read are aware. Probably not even 1/10 of 1/10. Unless you like some very obscure literature. When I say Superman, what do you think of? If you didn't say a flying man in red underwear with a cape, you're a liar. If I say Aslan, yeah, if you're even vaguely aware of children's literature, you're going to think of a lion with a Jesus complex. These ideas are so ingrained in you and everyone else that they are physically hard for you to alter. These characters are not like me. An idea that gets set in everyone's head is one of the hardest things in the world to change. But if just the right amount of people put a little bit of stock into a certain thought, with just enough subtle differences here and there, that idea can live. That idea can move. That idea can dream. The books on the shelves of every second-hand bookstore are dreaming, and I am one of those dreams. That sounds purple prosy as hell, but stick with me here. This crap is important if you want to even scratch the surface of what's happening here. I could hear the hissing footsteps of the astronaut coming up behind us. He was injured and that suit looked heavy, so that was to our advantage. I looked at Funny, still clutching his fingers. He had no idea as to the nature of this universe. As far as he was concerned, this warehouse in this New York was the end-all be-all. The real McCoy. There wouldn't be any explaining this away. So it looked like he was about to get a field education. My thoughts were broken up as the crate next to us started to hiss. Suddenly, in a burst of splintering material and acrid smoke, a ball of plasma broke through close enough to give me a haircut. I pulled my coat up to protect my head from the shrapnel as Funny screamed and threw himself to the ground. The crackling ball of death sailed over us and slammed into the next shipping crate, burning right through it and onto the next down the line. I hazarded a peek backwards into the resulting hole. Through 5 other holes, through 5 other separate crates, I could see the spaceman, his gun levelled squarely at my head. I grabbed Funny by the collar and jerked him up after me a few moments before another shower of splinters tore through the crates behind us. We couldn't run for the exit without putting a target on our backs, and hiding behind cover didn't seem like the best option in the universe when facing a gun that could apparently eat through damn near anything. Our options were limited, but there was one thing that might be able to save us from an early disintegration. As you probably guessed by now, the Buck Rogers with a grudge currently trying to kill me wasn't from my book. My book is a little-known title called Cats and Magpies by one Eliza Johnson, circa 1980-something or other. It was a story with a distinct lack of killer spacemen. That didn't stop them from wandering through every now and again. You see, when I say that an idea can grow legs, I mean that in more ways than simply the figurative kinds. Once you realise that your world is made of words, you can start to see the places where those words get a bit fuzzy. And once you can see those, well, you can put your legs to use. As we ran, I looked up at the floodlight above our heads. It was still swinging back and forth from the impact the spaceman had made outside, sending our shadows lurching back and forth like drunken track stars as we booked it across the warehouse floor. I felt another surge of heat at my back, but I didn't spare a moment to look back. Funny was screaming his head off behind me as I dragged him along. His lungs were starting to catch up on him, and I knew he couldn't keep this up for very long. As the floodlight swung our way, my plan solidified. It wasn't going to be pleasant, particularly for Funny, but it was better than the alternative. That gun seemed to have a small period of inactivity between shots. Otherwise Darth Vader wouldn't have just popped one off every few seconds. If that thing could fire like a machine gun, then we'd be dead already. It probably had some kind of charging period, if I had to guess. And at that moment, I did. I steered funny towards another row of shipping crates, but this time I stopped right behind the first instead of running deeper. The spaceman overcompensated, assuming we'd go deep behind cover and let loose another burst of terrifying energy that burned a hole through a crate 3 rows down. I took a breath. When it goes dark, do not let go of my hand, no matter what happens, got it? I didn't wait for Funny's reply. I stepped out from behind cover and took aim at the floodlight. Out of the corner of my vision I could see the ray gun pointed squarely at me, but my prediction was correct, and I wasn't immediately reduced to molten slag. I squeezed the trigger, and everything went dark in a rain of shattered glass. I grabbed Funny's good hand and we were sprinting again, this time towards the spaceman. The lights along the sides of his suit were obvious in the dark of the warehouse. I could feel Funny trying to go against me, but he didn't have the strength. I tugged him right by our futuristic hitman and out the truck entrance into the rainy New York night. The author of this book had taken great pains to describe the insides of the warehouse. The wet floors, the rows of crates, the floodlight. But out here, she'd hardly mentioned what the docks actually looked like, and that made them a weak point. Particularly next to the burning crater where my futuristic friend had landed. Lightning flashed, painting the world in stark black and white. I could see where the corners of my world got fuzzy and indistinct. I pulled Funny towards the crater, and we sailed through the walls of the universe. Jumping from one book to another is kind of like jumping into the middle of the ocean. There's a shock of cold as your body acclimates, and then a kind of muted feeling of weighting nothing. You're aware of how small you are compared to the nearly infinite watery space stretching out in all directions. You kind of just float there in a haze. Time means very little in between pages. You could be there for a few seconds, or a few hours, until you're not quite sure where it ends and you begin. Words flood through your mind, your own and those of others. You start to feel detached, unreal, and just before you think you might wink out of existence, you're tossed back into a noisy, sensation-filled world, for better or for worse. I remembered the first time I had ever experienced it. The first time I had realised the nature of my existence, and things expanded for me. I'm not sure how long ago it was. Time is funny in books. It was raining that day too, and just like any good detective story, it all started with a dame. I was just a regular detective back then. If you thought the clichés from earlier were bad, you should have seen me before. I spared you the most of it, but it's a habit that's hard to shake. I think if I ever met anyone from the actual 20s, they would probably punch me in the face. I was trying to stay dry, just like everyone else walking the streets. It wasn't the steady dribble I'd walked through earlier. This was the kind of rain that would soak you to the bone if you let it. Under the force of the falling water, umbrellas sprouted out of storefronts like mushrooms in the dark. I made slow progress to my office. The building it was housed in was a slightly run-down but sturdy place, about 14 stories all told. I walked through the glass doors at the front and shook the rain from my coat, nodding to the doorman as I did. The air conditioning in here had never been good, but the rain made it a bit chilly. I shook it off and walked up to the desk where a girl sat in her usual place. Mary Malone. She was black. Her father, Marshall Malone, actually owned the building. He was a hard man. He had no other choice, really. It was rare for anyone that wasn't white to own a car, let alone a building. There were rumours as to how he'd managed it. Everything from winning the building in a card game against the KKK to using voodoo to hypnotise the original owner. I didn't believe any of that. I just figured he was a hard-working man who didn't deserve half the guff he got. Mary was a pretty girl. She was tall, maybe 5'7", her hair hanging around her ears in a flapper-esque kind of look. She smiled at me. Mary was generally friendly, to the point where you wouldn't think she had a loaded shotgun under the desk. "Hello, Mr. Combs. Any luck on your latest case?" she said pleasantly. I grumbled and shook my head, offering a mumbled word of greeting in return as I walked to the elevator and stepped inside. Normally I would have stopped and chatted with Mary, but today I was in a bad mood. She was talking about the case, the one that had haunted me for months now. The case that all other cases seemed to be tied to in this damn city. A writer had been killed, one George Gadsden. He hadn't been a particularly popular author. He'd written a few period novels about life in his home country of England. In all respects, he was totally unremarkable. That is, until his death. He'd been found in his office by his editor, slumped over his desk, a finished manuscript for a book called Patience, slowly soaking up blood. A quill of solid gold jutting from his eye socket, and a long, slender woman's glove draped over the back of his chair. The editor said that all his doors and windows had been locked from the inside. Gadsden hadn't been popular before his death, but after the story hit the news, the shops couldn't keep his books in stock. Patience wasn't set to be released until later in the year, and I'd heard the local shopkeepers were already sold out. People were so wrapped up in the story that they weren't looking at the facts. Who would kill Gadsden? The police had fingered a woman, a known outlaw who worked the speakeasy scene. She was dangerous, that much I was sure of, but I didn't buy that she was the killer. I'd managed to get the glove. It was her usual style, a pretty silk thing that reached up to her elbows. Its dark black raven colour matched her hair. I exited the elevator and made my way down the hall to my office door. It was the usual number, a large, cheap door with a pane of fogged glass with the word Combs printed across it in bold black letters. It was spelt with an E. My name didn't have an E in it, but getting it redone would have been expensive, so I didn't bother. The thing that bothered me at the moment was the fact that there was a shadow on the other side. I immediately checked my pocket. The key was still there. It was the only copy besides the one in Mr. Malone's office. I'd heard tales that it was easier to get into Fort Knox than it was to get in there without an express invitation. Still, whoever they were, they'd managed to get into my office, so the how hardly mattered. Right now the thing to find out was why. I reached into my coat and wrapped my hand around my pistol. With my left hand I unlocked the door and slowly turned the knob. Cassandra Carlyle sat on my desk, holding her glove in hand. She was wearing a black dress that covered her legs. Still, it didn't leave much to the imagination. That thing hugged her curves like a lover home from war, and the way she was sitting didn't help. She wore a large, wide-brimmed hat above her head. Her dark hair cascaded from underneath, in soft, lengthy curls that played around her shoulders. She turned to me with a smile. "Hello, Cats. Is that a gun in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me?" I grimaced and drew my hand away from my gun. "Hello, Cassandra. How did you get into my office?" She put the glove on, making a show of it as the silky fabric drew up along her naked arm. "I needed my glove," she said, as though explaining she'd left it there herself. "And is that really the most interesting question you could ask?" I closed the door behind me and stepped inside. "All right, fine. Why are you in my office? I know you're not just here for a bit of clothing." Her smile curled along her features a little more. "There we go," she chuckled, standing up and sauntering over to me. "Well, I'm wanted for murder. Perhaps I'm here to turn myself in." I scoffed. "Yeah, and pigs fly. You can sell it, but I'm not buying it, dollface." "Like I said, I was a lot worse back then." She chuckled. "Fair enough. Though I can't help but notice you're not exactly cuffing me right now. Not, what would you call it? Ringing up the fuzz, calling in the red and blues, helping the cats find the mouse." She leaned against my chest. She was a little shorter than me. The top of her hat came up to my nose. I couldn't help but notice she was wearing perfume. "Cats?" I shrugged her off and walked to my desk. "That's because I don't think you're guilty." She arched a brow. "Oh, really? And why's that?" "It doesn't fit you." I took a seat, looking her over. "You're a bad girl, but not quite that bad. I've never known you to be a murderer. Maybe an accessory, but never the trigger woman. And even then, you've never been that sloppy. The whole thing has frame-up written all over it." She nodded with an approving hum. "Very good. But now the question is, who's framing me? And why?" I shrugged. "I don't know. By all rights, I shouldn't even be talking to you right now. But you are, so humour me." I looked her up and down, resting my head on a hand. Well, fine. I can figure the why. The way I see it, you got bright disease, Toots. She tilted her head. Bright disease? You know too much. You've got the wrong kind of info on the wrong kind of man, and he wants you dead. I gestured out the window. But you've got too many friends in high places for him to kill you outright. Best way to take you down, were that the case, would be letting you take the rap for this. The police take you out, possibly with a bribe to make sure something goes wrong while you're resisting arrest. 2 birds, 1 stone. They kill a man they probably wanted dead anyway, and with the police being so trigger-happy, it'd look clean. I looked back at her, meeting her dark brown eyes. Though she had a good poker face, I could still see a bit of worry. I'd skip town. This sickness is fatal 9 times out of 10. She was quiet. I could hear the cars on the street and the sound of the city as we stared each other down. She broke first and looked away. Will you help me? I frowned, rubbing my face with a hand. It was risky business getting involved with anything Cassandra Carlyle had her hands in. She might not have been a murderer, but people around her tended to wind up dead nonetheless. She dealt with everyone from run-runners to mafia men. Every big con from here to New Jersey had her fingerprints on it somewhere. She was a star, burning hot and fast. Anyone who got too close tended to burn up. Still, far be it for me to ignore a woman in trouble. I sighed. The way I see it, if I'm going to be involved in this case, I'll probably end up doing that anyway. She nodded, her smile returning. You probably will. My expression hardened. But no funny business, got it? I want this thing clean. She put her hands up, looking to all the world like an innocent woman who was down on her luck. Of course. Clean is my middle name. I felt a smirk quirk at the edge of my lips. Cassandra Clean Carlyle? She shrugged. It fits with the whole alliteration thing, doesn't it? I blinked. What? She looked different instantly. Her stance became a little less seductive and a little more practical. That wasn't all. She appeared more solid. I'm not sure how else to put it, really. She seemed to be more there than she had a minute ago. Look, Cats, if you're going to do this thing clean, and be any kind of help to me, then you need to know everything, or we're going to die. I stood up, but I felt off balance. I reached out and caught myself on the edge of the desk. To die? And what don't I know exactly? She took a step towards my desk and put a gloved hand on my own, leaning in until her nose was no more than an inch away from mine. Doesn't it bug you that nearly everyone in this story has alliterative names? I ripped my hand from hers and stumbled back. Why did I feel dizzy suddenly? That's not that unusual. She stepped back with me, not letting up. Mary Malone, Marshall Malone. The people who own this building. She swung a hand out behind her. George Gadsden. The murdered man? She pointed to herself. Cassandra Carlyle. She jabbed me dead in the chest. Her finger felt hard as stone. Catsgrove Combs. As she pressed that finger against me, I felt as though I might fall right through my office wall. I reached out behind me and pressed a palm against it to make sure it was solid. The room was spinning. Everything except for her. For God's sake, Cats, it's like we live in a freaking comic book. I felt sick. I needed to get out of here. I reached out to push past her, but she wouldn't move. It was like trying to push over a brick wall with a straw. I felt weak, like my head was trying to push its way out through my ears. She grabbed my hand and lifted it above my head as I nearly fell to my knees. I was held front and centre as she pressed on. This world is full of stuff like that. You're a detective. You're the main character. You have to have noticed it. All you have to do is look. She groaned incredulously. I came in and asked, is that a gun in your pocket or are you just happy to see me? Who says that? And you called me Toots. Toots! I tried to break away, but she was strong. Her grip was like a vice. I shuddered. It was all I could do to keep my lunch down. What was she doing to my... I can hear your goddamn monologue. What? Every word, You're an open book, Cats, and I've had lots of practice. Learn to do it quietly, or it will get you killed. What's happening? How are you in my head? I'm not. I'm in the prose. Don't worry, I won't stay long. Readers get horribly confused without quotation marks. I'm just making a point. You, Catsgrove Combs, know nothing. You know less than nothing. You have only scratched 1/10 of 1/10 of the universe around you, and if you don't learn quick, you are going to die. And I am going to die. I don't want to die, so I'm going to teach you. Quickly. Her lips started moving again. You are not real. I am not real. All of this is fictional. We are a story, a figment, a dime store novel left to rot in a grandmother's basement. I made a heaving noise, but nothing came up. You're crazy? What's your mother's name? I opened my mouth, then closed it. I couldn't remember. I heaved again. This time the bile rose into my mouth before I could swallow it back down. I almost made a mess of the floor before I put my free hand over my mouth. Had I really never thought of my mother before now? I must have. What about Mother's Day? I'd never celebrated Mother's Day. Hell, I couldn't even remember it ever being Mother's Day. My whole body spasmed, but she held on tight. Her eyes burned at me and I could feel them looking. Really looking. I looked back. I could see her. And I could see her words. The same ones you do, scrolling across her features. Words like raven and dark, mysterious and alluring, all flashing in jumbles of print across her skin. I could see them in everything. The world around me became swirling words, and I crumbled to the floor as she released my hand. My glasses went flying as my body jerked and shook, rejecting everything that it was. The worded woman leaned down to me, and I could feel her lips close to my ear. Words like soft and smooth, secret and hidden, drummed against my body. You see, she said, her speech a bold, bright text. The way I see it, you got bright disease, Cats. You know too much. She paused for a moment, and I felt tight, hard words like predator, danger and survivor, so hard and sharp and jagged against my skin. You got two options, Toots, because this disease is fatal 9 times out of 10. You might crumble under the weight of this. If that happens, you'll wake up in bed, but it won't be this version of you. It'll be a different Catsgrove Combs, and he will be the man that never saw the writing on the wall. You'll solve your mysteries, and you'll always be the hero of your own story, but you will never know. Never really know. The man who knew will be dead and gone, another smudge of ink, wiped out. I think I must have been screaming. I'm not sure. I saw a sea of exclamation points. They danced in the air around us, like tribesmen before a sacrifice. Their varied sizes sweeping through the air like dust motes, and pounding along the floor like giants. That man never solves this case. Her words warred with the walls. I wasn't sure what was solid and what wasn't anymore. I could feel the corners of the world against my awareness. She was the only thing that wasn't senseless noise. The man who solves this case takes option 2. My body was on fire. He lives. He survives. You might not be real, but you are alive. And so am I. Words like sand and silk and sleep left her throat as she sighed. This case is bigger than me. It's bigger than you, and it's bigger than this book. Your perspective is the ultimate one here, so I need you on this. Adapt or die. I couldn't remember my mother. Did I have a family? I had a sister. Why did I have a sister? No. These were the wrong kinds of thoughts. The kinds of thoughts that threatened to pile atop me and grind me to dust. I tried to hold them back. So many of them flooded through my mind. I couldn't focus on them. Couldn't let them become the whole of me. They were too big. Far too big. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to leave this mystery unsolved. I wanted to know. I wanted to see this through to the end. to see what I didn't know. I built a dam in my head. I walled up all those big thoughts behind smaller ones. Who killed George Gatson? How was Cassandra involved? Why did she need me? And just what door had she opened inside my mind? Those thoughts tried to lead their way to bigger ones, but I kept them on a tight leash. I reeled them back and kept building that wall. Yes, that's it, Cassandra whispered. The world began to take form again. I could see my desk, and not just its description. The cheap walls of my office, they faded in and out, but they were becoming more distinct. I concentrated harder. I thought about the things I did know. I thought about my favourite cafe, a little hole in the wall a short walk away. I thought about Mary downstairs, smiling and greeting me. I thought about my pistol, my coat, my red hair and my glasses. My glasses. I'd dropped my glasses. I couldn't see without my glasses. Not well, anyway. I needed my glasses. I grabbed onto that thought like a life raft in a maelstrom. Glasses are powerful things. They allow clear sight, making hazy things clear and revealing that things aren't quite what you thought they were. They're symbols of knowledge and learning. I didn't know who Velma Dinkley was at that moment, but damn it if I didn't channel her with all my willpower. I reached out with a shaky, uncoordinated hand, and wrapped my fingers around the one thing that I chose to care about at that moment. With a ragged, hoarse scream, I reeled in the thoughts that threatened to destroy me, and put all my effort into one single action. I put on my glasses. The world shifted completely back into reality as I knew it, and I slumped to the ground, exhausted. Cassandra Carlyle smiled down at me with a nod of approval. Very good. I couldn't answer. It felt like I hadn't breathed in years. I lay there, gasping like a fish. Now for your next lesson. Without another word, she reached out and touched me. The world shifted and we fell out of my universe. That was the first time I felt that great, vast emptiness. The first time I felt the place between places. I didn't react well. I screamed and thrashed and tried desperately to find my way out. I couldn't feel Cassandra, or any of the things I'd come to know. I may as well have been on Mars for all I knew. It was blank. It was empty, and yet it was full and terrifying. It was at that moment it became even clearer to me what I was in the scheme of things. It was not a pleasant awakening. But in both a second and an eternity it was over. I fell face first onto the mossy grass of an 18th century forest, Cassandra standing at my side. I just lay there, shaking like a newborn puppy. I was too frightened to move as Cassandra began to speak. This is a story called The Girl in the Wall. I'll leave it to you to figure out what genre it is. I could hear her high heels crunching against the leaves as she began to walk away. I will give you 3 pieces of advice. Stay out of the shadows, cross running water, and never trust the first person you meet. Somewhere among the trees a little girl giggled in a way no child should ever giggle. Second verse, same as the first. She looked back at me over her shoulder. Adapt or die. Good luck. Cassandra vanished. I learned fast. Jennifer Tolska sat hunched against the corridor wall, breathing heavily. Beside her, the remains of a strange gun sparked fitfully. It wasn't of any use anymore. On her sleeve, her suit's readout told her that she'd broken 3 ribs and had fractured her arm. She grimaced in pain as it provided her with the local anaesthetic to her wounds. She'd have to get to a healing pod soon. She could feel her ribs grinding oddly inside her chest as she moved, and she didn't fancy the idea of getting too active with them moving around like that. Now wasn't the time for worrying. She'd have to store that thought away for later. Right now she had to make sure the ship was in full working order. The fight might have damaged crucial systems. Even if she had managed to fend him off, it wouldn't matter much if the life support failed as a result. She was a tiny thing, hardly 5 feet tall, and she felt even smaller as she stood painfully upright in the hallway. Her fine black hair fell in messy ribbons around her face as she took a careful step forward. Her ribs complained loudly, but she ignored them. The floor glowed faintly, an arrow appearing to helpfully guide her to the control room. The ship wasn't a large one, but getting knocked around had disoriented her, and the ship was just as aware as she was that all the hallways looked pretty much the same. She made slow, steady progress in the directions the ship guided her, keeping her sounds of pain to a minimum. What had he been thinking? He'd just gone off the handle, shooting like an idiot without a care in the world. She'd thought she'd known him, thought she could trust him. Apparently not. These troubled thoughts crossed her mind, but they weren't even her biggest concern. She'd fought him off, but where had he gone? She turned to look at a display on the wall. It showed a view outside the ship, the harsh orange of a distant sun staring back at her as the ship spun gently around it. Out here, there was nowhere to go. Even if she had killed him with that last shot, his body should still have been here. She felt a tightness in her chest, a quick flutter of the heart. Was she alone? Jennifer choked down a panicked sob and limped towards a pair of doors, which swung open politely for her. The empty control room stretched in front of her. On the various panels around the captain's chair was a sea of red lights.
"Hello, Miss Tulska,"
said a tinny voice that didn't sound at all like there had been a life-and-death struggle a few minutes ago.
"You probably want the ship reports, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I'm happy to oblige."
There was a cheerful beeping noise as she settled with some difficulty into the chair.
"It appears that your little disagreement with Mr. Clark has caused more than a little bit of damage. We've lost food storage containers 1 through 3, and one of the oxygen generators is only working at 30% capacity."
Those figures sent a lurch through Jennifer's stomach. She took a deep breath. Yes, she said with a slight Russian weight to her voice. "I'll worry about that in a moment. For now, can you tell me, where is Mr. Clark?"
"Sure,"
the ship chirped.
"Checking all ship's compartments now."
Jennifer's fingers tightened against the armrest as she waited. With the oxygen generators damaged, she knew she had to keep her heart rate low. Stay calm.
"Check complete. Mr. Clark is not aboard the ship."
Jennifer blinked. "Check escape pods, decompression logs, and for life signs within the quadrant."
"Sure. Checking given parameters now."
Jennifer waited in silence as the machine worked. She busied herself moving around power levels and turning knobs to compensate for the damage the earlier fight had caused.
"Check complete. All escape pods accounted for. Decompression logs show no use in the past 24 hours, and there are no signs of life for 4 quadrants in any direction."
Jennifer's fingers froze in mid-gesture. "Check again."
"Oh, I thought you might ask. So I checked 14,234,532,122 times in the last minute. All analysis shows that you are alone."
She stared at the console. "But how is that possible?"
"I do not know. All statistical data states that the probability of Mr. Clark randomly disintegrating is less than 0.0001%, so I am at a loss to explain it. If he were dead, my crew member death contingencies would have been activated, and his component parts would currently be in the medical bay being harvested for protein and various
That's enough of an explanation, thank you. She took a deep breath. Remember training. Keep calm. Conserve oxygen. Worry about impossibilities later. Can you repair the damaged oxygen generator?
"Yes."
How long will it take?
5 hours.
How much oxygen do I have till then?
3 hours if you slow your current metabolic rate by 43%.
Oh.
Yes.
This news did not help her heart rate. Have we got any stasis fluid?
Yes.
How much?
Enough to place an adult human female in stasis.
Oh, thank God.
For 5 minutes.
Jennifer held back the urge to yell in frustration. That would have been a waste of air. She needed to stay calm, assess her options. She would have all the oxygen she needed in 5 hours, but she would run out of oxygen in 3. Stasis wasn't an option, and it was taking all she could do not to start hyperventilating. On top of everything else, there was still the pressing issue of what had happened to Mr. Clark. The fact that he had tried to kill her was worrying enough. The fact that she now had no idea where he was, or if he was even still alive, was downright terrifying. She'd lost her gun in the scuffle. She was unarmed and apparently all alone. What the hell was that? Jennifer almost jumped out of her skin as a raspy voice hit her ears from the hallway.
Good news.
the computer declared. Jennifer pulled her legs off the ground, hiding her body in the captain's chair. Her voice came out in a hurried whisper. "Mr. Clark? Where is he?"
"No, Mr. Clark is still absent from the universe in any given direction. The good news is you're not alone. There are 2 filthy, unidentified human males aboard the ship. Shall I send them the customary welcome? You may choose from blue confetti, red confetti, or a mixture of both."
But how is that possible? We're light years from anywhere remotely inhabitable. There's no other ships that can even travel this far.
"They did not board from a ship."
What?
"They simply began to exist somewhere near the sleeping area."
Jennifer was not very calm. What do you mean they just began to exist?
"They spontaneously came into being. They are coming this way. You really should pick a confetti colour."
Jennifer gave a groan of frustration. She looked around the control room and spied a welding torch laying on the ground near her chair. She grabbed it as she got out of her chair and started out into the hallways, ignoring the progressively worsening pain in her ribs. Catsgrove Combs was sick in the corner of the sleeping area. He could feel that the gravity in wherever this place wasn't quite right. It felt a bit too heavy and a bit too light at the same time. At least he'd managed to stay upright. Funny, his slightly unwilling companion, was laying in a moaning ball in the opposite corner. "I figured Spaceman wasn't from a fantasy novel," Catsgrove grumbled ruefully as he took in the room. Large video screens covered a portion of the opposite wall, flashing warnings in their general All right, enough of that. There didn't appear to be much of a narrator in this book, besides the usual bit of descriptive prose anyway. It was easy enough to nudge it towards something I was more comfortable with. Detective novels are always in first-person perspective. I was a creature of habit, and I liked to keep it that way if I could. Call me a control freak if you wish. From the looks of things, this was a science fiction world. I wasn't sure which one. If I spent enough time here, I could probably get a general feel for the basics, but I didn't plan on making a vacation home or anything. I doubted it would take Buzz Lightyear very long to figure out that we'd taken his route home and follow behind. Science fiction is a gaudy, depressing genre. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of fun to be had in anti-gravity, and the technology was amazing, but particularly in recent years, science fiction has been about humans facing adversity. It seemed that humanity had a hard-on for the apocalypse, and cautionary tales ran rampant. From my perspective, they're not so cautionary. They're avoid at all costs. Seeing 1 or 2 end-of-the-world scenarios was enough, thank you very much. Still, this seemed like a very standard old-school sci-fi setup. Everything had a slight glow to it, like the world's most expensive nightlight. There were 2 uncomfortable-looking sleeping cots on either side. I could hear Funny retching pitifully in the corner. I was used to this kind of thing, but this was his first jump, and it was just his luck that it happened to be a jump into outer space. I looked out a nearby window. I had to squint as the light of an unfamiliar star assaulted my eyeballs. It was majestic and all, but at that moment I had bigger things to worry about. Something the earlier narration had said worried me. I looked back towards the screens on the opposite wall and noticed the flashing warnings. They flickered by too fast for me to make out much, but I caught a few words like oxygen levels and intruders, along with happy little phrases like imminent demise and food storage minimal. I took another look around the cabin and noticed some things I hadn't before. There were scorch marks, along with deep holes in some of the walls. A nearby shelf had had its contents knocked to the floor. It wasn't much, just a few books and a picture of a black-haired woman smiling in the arms of a blonde. Perhaps they were sisters. I didn't know, and at that moment it hardly mattered. It seemed our spaceman had not come from a happy place. He'd been bleeding, and now I could see why. There must have been a fight here. Funny made another noise. I think he'd brought up everything he'd eaten in the past 2 days, maybe more judging by how bad he looked. He forgot about his finger and tried to get up, hissing in pain as he put weight on his hand. I took a step and caught him before he fell over. Those oversized eyes of his looked about ready to pop out of his head as he looked around the room. Back where he was from, neon lights were still a hot new thing. This might have been a little overstimulating. I didn't give him much time to adjust. I felt bad for him, but we didn't have time to sightsee. I tugged him out of the room and into the hallway. If the spaceman decided to follow us, he'd appear in the same room, and I wanted to put as much distance between him and us as possible. If we could find another spot in the world to jump from. The thing about sci-fi novels is they're fairly tightly written most of the time, particularly your average space opera, which is what I had to guess is what we were in. Small, iconic-looking ships that sometimes had whole maps devoted to them just under the front cover. They were not books that were easy to get out of. The reason the sleeping quarters were probably so open is because no one wants to read about Captain McSpace Hero putting on his jammies and catching some Z's. The hallway wasn't a wide one, but it was enough for me to walk side by side with Funny. There were occasional vents in the floors and walls, but other than that everything was pristine and white in colour. Funny jabbered senselessly at my side. Some people took to this kind of thing well. Others didn't. As we walked, I contemplated our situation. Here we are, in a book I wasn't familiar with no bearing on our time period or place, and for all I knew there was an astronaut bent on killing us not far behind. Things weren't looking good. This kind of thing wasn't supposed to happen. Usually there were provisions in place. A border patrol kind of deal. Where were the editors? Funny finally managed to become semi-intelligible. What the hell was that? I held on to him as he started to panic, putting a finger from my free hand to my lip. Shh! Now really isn't the time to explain it. What the hell was that? I don't even think he was listening to me. Funny, calm down. I gave him a shake. Look, I'll explain it all when we're back home. For now, I just need you to listen to everything I have to say, and try not to die, okay? He just hyperventilated and looked like he was about to be sick again. I shook my head and kept walking, more or less tugging him behind me. There didn't seem to be any holes in the prose nearby. That didn't bode well. This was tight, even by space opera standards. It was just my luck to break into something particularly well written. That was a monster man, like one of those things out of the pictures. Some guy from beyond the stars. Funny was getting frantic. I saw an opportunity. I propped Funny up against the wall and gave him a level stare. That's right, you got it. Aliens. That's it. Like in the pictures and the comics. You know War of the Worlds? H.G. Wells? You look like a well-read fella, right, Henry? He still looked panicked, but using his real name seemed to bring him down a little. He nodded. I've heard of that. I nodded back. Well, it's real. All of it. The aliens, the little green men, everything. We've been abducted, Funny. He gave a terrified squeak and I placed a hand over his mouth. I know that's scary, but you're in luck. See, I'm not just an ordinary detective. I'm... an alien detective. That's why I didn't panic back there in the warehouse. I do this kind of stuff all the time. Just stick with me, and you'll be okay. This must be maybe the 6th abduction I've escaped from this week. We looked at each other for a moment, and I slowly took my hand away from his mouth. I could see him appraising me, then taking in his surroundings. I could almost hear the gears shifting around in his head. They desperately needed some oil. 6th? I nodded. 6th. He took a deep, shaky breath and closed his eyes. All right. What do we do? I relaxed my grip on him and took a step down the hallway, keeping an eye on him over my shoulder. Like I said, listen to everything I say and try not to die. I turned around and immediately stopped about an inch before a welder's torch burned my face off. I made a frankly unflattering noise and fell back on my elbows, crab walking away from a woman who was 5 nothing and probably 120 pounds sopping wet. She was the same woman from the photo I'd seen earlier, only a lot worse for wear. She wore the same kind of suit the spaceman had been, only minus the helmet and plus a few scorch marks, a mess of black hair falling around her face. She had small, dainty features, but there was a strange hardness to them as she glared down at me. She held the welding torch in front of her. It wasn't like the kind I was used to back home. For one, I didn't need to wear a welder's mask to look at it. It kind of glowed a gentle blue, but judging from the tan I was getting, it was just as hot. She stepped closer, with the kind of expression that told me all I needed to know about how much she was willing to use that improvised weapon. "Who are you? And how did you get aboard this ship?" Oh, great. Out of the frying pan. "Whoa there!" I put my hands up. She took a step towards me. I saw her fingers depress some kind of button. The bright blue flame gushing from the tip lengthened by about a foot. She leaned down and I had to scooch back to avoid getting a second mouth. "Answer the question." I felt my pistol's weight against my chest. I put it back in my coat on reflex. I very much doubted I could draw it before I suddenly obtained an intense sympathy for the marshmallow in a s'more. From the looks of things, she didn't seem to be in league with the other character from this story. If the other guy was any indication, she wouldn't have stopped to ask questions. I noticed that with her free hand, she clutched her side. Under the threatening grimace, I could see pain dancing over her features. I thought back to the sleeping quarters, the scorch marks on the walls and the ones that marred her suit. Someone had shot our spaceman. He'd been bleeding. My gun hadn't done a thing, but the weapons they had here might. I decided to try my luck. "You've had a crew member turn on you recently, haven't you?" I saw her expression crack a little, before turning into something altogether harder. "Yes, and then he vanished, and, since you just appeared, I'm inclined to think that you might have something to do with it." The heat blasting my skin began to grow painful as she leaned closer. "No, we didn't. Look at us. Look at our clothes. Anything strike you as strange? Do we seem like the spacefaring types?" She paused, appraising me. She turned to Funny, who was shuddering like a leaf against the wall. She took a bit too long for my taste to decide whether or not we were worth flambeing, but she backed off a little. Not by much, though. "Computer?" A voice that sounded a bit like Bob Ross and a Speak and Say had a one-night stand chimed in.
"Hello. Are you about to ask where these two filthy human males are from?"
The woman with the blowtorch looked as though she wanted to rub her temples. "Yes?"
"The answer is not very probable."
She looked up at nowhere in particular. "Tell me anyway."
"Well, all searches from my database, taking into account their style of dress and dirt particles filtered through the working regulators, indicate that they are from Earth."
Her eyes widened. "What?"
"Circa 1920.
"What?" She looked down at me and Funny again, then back to the air. "That's impossible."
"No, it's not probable. You should really work on your listening skills,"
the computer chirped. The woman backed off completely. She looked between us and the air a few times before speaking. 1920. And Earth is light years away, she murmured, more to herself than anything. I put a hand up and tried to sound calm. "Look, I know it's strange, but—" She shot me a glare that could have peeled paint off a wall. "And it's dead." Funny made a choking noise and there was a thump behind me. I risked a turn of my head. He'd fainted, his bowler hat rolling jauntily down the hallway like a runaway coin. Damn it, I knew it. I hate science fiction. Why did the world always have to end to make a story more exciting? Weren't asteroids and space aliens enough? No, got to blow up a planet or two to add suspense. The way the lady astronaut was looking at me, I could tell she was in no mood for small talk. She was hurt, probably scared, and she'd just heard something impossible. In my experience, that is not a good mix. There was one thing I could try. For all of its occasional bouts of gloom and doom, there were some advantages to science fiction if you knew what you were doing. One of them was technobabble. When in doubt, lie your ass off. Of course, I know it's dead, but the computer was right. I put on my most serious face and very slowly got to my feet. We're time agents. The blowtorch got a little too close for comfort again. Time agents? I nodded, trying to think of every time travel B-movie and bad novel I'd ever encountered. If this was your usual humans leave a dying Earth story, I could probably fill in the blanks pretty well. Yes, time agents. In the final days of Earth, before the evacuation. I checked her face to make sure I hadn't tripped up anywhere. She nodded for me to continue, so I took that as a good sign. Scientists underneath New York were working on a secret project in order to save the world we destroyed for our terrible hubris. Hey, if I'm going to spin a story, I might as well get a bit poetic about it. The woman raised her eyebrow. What project? I tried not to look nervous. Well, you see, it was too late for Earth as we knew it, but one scientist, Ludwig von Heinz, yeah, that sounded German enough, managed to crack the secret to manipulating the fabric of time. He sent 2 agents back to the era where everything started to go wrong, the 1920s, right when America began to become truly industrialized. I paused to assess how this was going. She still looked on board. Time to drive the nail home. Your other crew member has also discovered this technology, and that is why he turned on you, and how he escaped the ship. I was interrupted as I found a gloved fist occupying the same space as my nose. She might have looked small, but she knew how to punch. The surprise of it almost knocked me over. I only managed to stay upright due to a nearby wall. "You're lying through your goddamn teeth," she hissed. I got the wind knocked out of me as she pressed an elbow into my chest. Holding the blowtorch so close my glasses fogged up from the sudden temperature change. "Truth, now. This ship is running out of oxygen, and I'll survive longer if neither of you are breathing. So I'd hurry." I wheezed, finding it hard to get a breath with her pressing against me. I had her by £50 easy, but she had the leverage. I wasn't going anywhere. Great. If she didn't believe that, there was no way in hell she was going to believe what was actually going on here. My options were limited. She seemed way too smart to fall for that technobabble crap. If I tried another story, she might kill me. But if I tried the truth, the best-case scenario would be incapacitating her for a few minutes. That, or it would kill her. I didn't fancy any of those options. Heck, half of that was assuming she didn't just kill me the second I tried to tell her her life was a story. Oh, what a plethora of options at my disposal.
"Pardon my interruption, Miss Tolska,"
the computer chimed in. "What is it?" she said, not taking her eyes off me.
"Mr. Clark is now aboard the ship."
The world turned into a washing machine as an explosion rocked the ship. The woman with the blowtorch was thrown away from me, slamming into the opposite wall with a heavy thud. My stomach lurched as the floor became the ceiling. Funny was tossed like a rag doll, flying beyond my field of vision. My hands immediately went to my glasses, holding on for dear life. My body tried to compensate for the sudden shift, only to be twirled in a loop as I left the floor completely, sending me into a wild spin.
"Artificial gravity no longer functioning,"
the computer warbled.
"Warning! Warning! I have some bad news to report. Ship falling out of orbit. Impact with nearest celestial body in T-1 hour.
I reached out a hand. I had to find something to steady myself. I managed to snag the edge of a box attached to the wall, filled with buttons I couldn't begin to recognize. I almost dislocated my shoulder as I came to a hard stop. My breath came out in quick, panicked pants, my coat floating around my body as the ship shuddered and groaned. I found myself in front of a window, staring out into the vastness of space. Before me, the harsh light of the star the ship orbited glared back, getting closer by the moment. I could hear the heavy footsteps of the spaceman coming down the hall, the smell of ozone now terrifyingly familiar in my nose. Somewhere among the floating debris, Funny groaned. This was not going to be a fun day. To be continued in Misprinted, Claws Sharp.